and welcome to this latest Sport for Business webinar in partnership with our good friends at Rugby Players Ireland. And it's all about the Tackle Your Feelings campaign, which has been on the go out there, making a real impact on the mental well-being of players, of fans, of anybody who has an interest in rugby and further beyond as well, supported, of course, by Zurich. And we are joined this morning by three people who will be able to really give us a good sense as to where our mental well-being is and possibly could be in relation to returning to the workplace. Some of us are doing it, some of us are looking forward to it, some of us are dreading it, and there is a space for all of those emotions along the way. Those colleagues now who will be talking us through, we're going to have a discussion, a panel discussion featuring Dr. Deirdre Lyons, who is a player development manager with Rugby Players Ireland, with Dr. Damien Lowry, a consultant psychologist and very clever man, and Dr. Hannah McCormack, who is going to be kicking us off and leading us with a presentation and then joining us for the panel discussion afterwards. We're going to have a chat and a conversation about some of the themes that arise, but an important part of this as well is that time that we're going to devote over at the end to seeing what you want to actually hear and feel about the conversations that we're having. So in order to do that, I think the easiest way, and to avoid having to switch on your camera and find that Friday morning bedhead or anything else that might be out there, we're going to do it through the Q&A button, which you should be able to see. It's normally at the bottom of my screen and normally at the bottom of most people's screen, a little button down there, and you can just enter your question in there. You can either do it with your name or anonymously. Please don't feel any pressure if there's something that you think might be a little more personal, but that you would like to ask in this forum. You can perfectly happily do it anonymously, and we will put that to the panel afterwards. But for the moment anyway, we will hand over to Hannah for a presentation to look at Tackle Your Feelings and how it works in the workplace. So over to you, Hannah.
Thanks, Rob, and thanks for having me and my fellow panelists here today. So I'll go into this quickly because I know the main portion of this will be the discussion that we have as a panel and obviously the Q&A section at the end. So obviously that's who I am, and the campaign is Tackle Your Feelings. Before I go anywhere else, I do want to say thank you to Rugby Players Ireland and obviously our sponsors, Zurich Insurance, who bring you the campaign and the workplace programme. So what I'm going to do now is just go through a really quick session or a really quick presentation talking about what well-being is and the way we view well-being and Tackle Your Feelings. Then go through some lessons from elite sport, and then obviously we'll go back to the panel discussion afterwards. So first off, what is well-being? So I'm going to just make this slide bigger so you can see it. When we talk about well-being in Tackle Your Feelings, the way I like to explain it to people is I want to explain it as a balance or an equilibrium between the challenges that you face and the resources that you have. So as you can see from the top hand, left-hand corner of the slide there, the challenges that a lot of people are facing right now, probably the biggest challenge that we've potentially faced ever, is the idea of COVID and coronavirus and everything that brings along with it. So there's obviously some work stress that goes along with that. We have the issue of, are we working from home? Are we working in the office? Are we transitioning between the two, and which one is going to happen? Money problems can also be huge challenges just in general, but also at the moment some people are feeling that a little bit more. One thing that COVID has brought that is potentially a little bit more unique than normal is a lack of connectivity and that feeling of isolation, not necessarily seeing the people who you would generally see Monday to Friday for 50 weeks of the year. All of these challenges are potentially outside of our control. The majority of challenges that we face are somewhat inevitable. Obviously, we weren't expecting to be facing a global pandemic, and a lot of the stresses that we experience, or a lot of life can be quite stressful. And like I said, that isn't necessarily in our control, but what can be in our control are the resources that we have that help us rebalance our well-being back to that balance or equilibrium, back to feeling okay. So obviously the challenges will have a negative impact or an impact on our perceptions of well-being and help or create that feeling of negative well-being. However, when you have resources, that those feelings of well-being will go back up into the positive. When the challenges occur, you will use your resources to bring you back to equilibrium. If you aren't experiencing any challenges at the moment, that influx of resources or that abundance of resources will take your feelings of well-being from being good to potentially being great or even the best. So resources such as resilience, resources such as support networks, your own personal values, communication, and even self-care and compassion, those things are so important at the moment. And just to give you an example, that is exactly where Tackle Your Feelings comes into it. Tackle Your Feelings can help you become aware of what your resources are and help you personally build and maintain the resources that you might need to get through these challenging times. So as Rob mentioned there, we are kind of in the process of potentially going back into the workplace or not really knowing what way we're going to be working for the next couple of months. And there is a general sense of unease about that. And that's not unusual. And that's very normal to experience. And everyone from every different industry and every different level of industry will have that. And then here's an example from one of our players, Kevin O'Byrne, playing for Munster. He said it's great to be back in the working environment and have a routine, but from going from restricted movement to group training was a bit nerve-wracking. And I think when we look at elite sports athletes or when we look at people who are kind of at that level, we think that they don't necessarily have these kind of feelings of trepidation. And then we try to emulate that and we try to pretend that everything is okay. But one thing to remember is that everyone is feeling this. This is a hard situation that we're in, and it's a very unusual situation because we've never had to deal with it before. Not only have we never had to deal with it before, but we've never had to deal with something like this for such an extended period of time. So there's a feeling of fatigue, there's a feeling of unease over what's going to happen. And a lot of this, like I said, is totally out of our control, and we're not 100% sure how to deal with that. So when things are feeling outside of our control, that can be incredibly overwhelming. So again, what can you do about it? One of the biggest messages that we want to get across with Tackle Your Feelings, and it's something that I know for sure that people in elite sport will always talk about this, and that's the controlling the controllables. When you're playing on a rugby team, there is only one thing that you can do, and that is you can control your own actions. You can't necessarily control what the opposition is going to do. You can't even control what your teammate or player is going to do. You may have set plays that you can run through, but you don't know if that person is going to make a decision to follow through on a call, or if they see a gap, they might want to run through it that wasn't necessarily in the plan. That is something that isn't in your control. And as Juliet Short, one of the women's national players, says, I'm still nervous at times, but it's about controlling the controllables. I'm doing all that's in my control. I wear the right gear and I follow the guidelines. And that's something that I think we can all take on, is we don't necessarily, and we can't necessarily have control over what other people do. We can't have control over whether or not people follow guidelines. We obviously don't have control over whether or not the government initiate certain restrictions. So what are the things that you can control? What are the things that you are able to do which takes away that feeling of being overwhelmed? And of course, we will discuss this more in the Q&A in the panel discussion later. Another thing that you can do, which I think is something that players do a lot, is set boundaries. So again, we all have certain areas that we will perform best in. When you look at a rugby team, there are 15 players on the pitch per team. Each person has a specific role, and each person knows where they should be on the field at any one time. You may find yourself out of that position as a fullback or as a winger. You may find yourself in a ruck, or once in a while you might find yourself in a maul, but that might not be where you're going to perform best. And it might be about removing yourself from those situations and allowing yourselves to operate in the boundaries where you are going to perform the best way possible. When it comes to coronavirus and working or transitioning back into the workplace, there are certain boundaries that you can set yourself. And again, a great example here from Kira. Griffin's the women's 15s captain. She was nervous about going back to training, and the big thing for her was making sure she wasn't putting people in her family at risk. And I think that's something to think about, is that when it comes to reintegrating into the workplace, when it comes to reintegrating into society a little bit more, where are you going to feel comfortable that you're not going to necessarily have a negative impact on your own health or on someone else's health? Another thing that we have to really focus on at the moment, and that would be really beneficial for our own mental health and well-being, is setting other boundaries around our actual work. So when we are working in an office, we can actually take the time to commute to that office, and that gives us the time to mentally prepare for the work ahead. When we are finished that work day, we usually leave everything behind, and we will take the physical distance or the physical detachment back to our place of relaxation. When we're working from home, there isn't necessarily, or sometimes we can't afford the luxury of having that distinct work area versus rest and relaxation area. So it's about potentially building those own boundaries for yourself, so that when it comes to 5 o'clock or 6 o'clock, that you put the laptop away, you lock it in a cupboard, you put it back in its laptop bag, and you remove it from your area of relaxation. It's really easy to kind of just go back to work because work is right there. When it comes to the weekends, protecting your downtime, setting that boundary around your downtime can have a real positive impact on your mental well-being. And again, it's the same with players. When they're not training, when they're not on the pitch, when they don't have to be in the gym, they're instructed to have certain levels of downtime. And what they do in that downtime can be totally up to them. But what we encourage and what is encouraged is that you fill that time with something that you enjoy, that is for you, or you catch up on certain things that you have to catch up on, but you try and not bring your work into it. Another thing which I think is really important in terms of mental well-being in general, but especially now, especially in the situation that we're in, is how we can say no. So a lot of the time we kind of have this feeling that we should be doing a lot of stuff to kind of, I suppose, reintegrate into society, meeting up with friends, trying to get on as many Zoom calls as possible. And because we know that that can have a positive impact on our well-being, and I'll talk about social support and the people that are in our squad and in our bubble in a moment. But sometimes it's more important to learn how to say no. And especially, again, if you have set a boundary for yourself, how do you make sure that you protect that boundary? A lot of the time it is by saying no. And saying no isn't always a negative thing. It can actually be really positive. Again, great example here from someone that most people will recognise, Greg O'Shea, Ireland Sevens player, and obviously he won a small competition there the other year, really thrust him into the limelight. And this is what he says about it. I felt like I had to do everything for other people to keep them happy. But what I decided, I sat down and said, it's me. You have to take care of number one first. And another great analogy that I use often is in relation to well-being, is when you're on it, when everyone hopefully can remember and probably dreams of it often, of getting onto a plane and going somewhere overseas. And we hear the safety announcement, and it says, put your own oxygen mask on first before you tend to anyone else. And it's about looking after yourself, putting yourself first. There's a misconception that looking after yourself and potentially saying no to things that are going to put you in an uncomfortable position or overwhelm you even more is selfish. But when you look after yourself, when you say no, and when you put yourself first, that can have a huge positive impact on your own mental well-being. Another lesson that we can take from elite sport, and I think can be really important, especially now, there's so much negative news out there. There's so much kind of doom and gloom in the greater world that can seep into our own thoughts, and that can kind of seep into our own day. One thing that players do, and it's an instructed thing that they have to do, they have to review their match day. They look back at certain tapes and they look at the things that are going well for them so that they can continue to work on those or continue to do them. And then they maybe highlight one or two areas where they can improve on. We should be able to do something like that as well. The idea of journaling, the idea of reviewing your day, especially if you're having a bad day, looking back and thinking, well, okay, that was one short moment in my day that didn't necessarily go very well. What are the good things that did happen? What things did go well? being nice to yourself, giving yourself that praise. The fact that we are working from home, a lot of us are working from home and might be continuing working from home for a while. We don't necessarily have that instantaneous feedback. We can't necessarily share the good things with other people. So reviewing your day and looking back at the things that have gone well can really help put you into a positive mindset, can really help you figure out, can even prepare you for how to face challenges in the future. And that's something that I think we can definitely take from elite sport. One of the biggest influencers on our overall health and happiness are the social support and relationships that we have. Anyone who knows me knows that I love talking about the Harvard study. And the Harvard study, for anyone who doesn't know or isn't familiar, was one of the longest running studies into human health and happiness that has been conducted. They took second year undergrad students from Harvard University in Boston in 1936, and they tracked their life trajectory for 75 to 80 years, and they even included their offspring in this study. And what they found was that the biggest influence on long-term health and happiness was actually the relationships that we have in life, and not necessarily the quantity, so not the number of friends that we have, but the quality relationships will have the biggest impact on your health and happiness. So at the moment, we don't necessarily have the luxury of just being able to go and meet our friends or go out for dinner or have large gatherings. So how is it that you can connect with those people? How can you forge positive relationships? How can you proactively work on your relationships in these times when things are so much more isolating? And that's where you want to kind of think about who is in your squad, who's in your bubble, who are the people that you know you can rely on and that you would happily turn around and help them out of a bad situation as well. One of the things that our players in Rugby Players Ireland around the country did, and they do on a general basis, you think of a squad, and there's potentially 40 people. You divide that in half between the backs and the forwards, you're down to 20, 22. But even within those units, or in those half squads, you have small units of around 8 people, and one person is a designated leader. And they continually contact each other and they continually get in touch. And that was something that was referred to often. We ran a little bit of research over the lockdown period just to track how our players' well-being was. And one of the things that they kept referring to was that they kept checking in with their teammates. They kept checking in with their squad. So once you have finished putting your own oxygen mask on, once you've set your own boundaries, once you've learned how to say no to things that are going to be putting you into awkward situations, who can you check on then? Who can you build that positive relationship with? Because when it comes to social support as well, you want to have a reciprocal relationship. So don't give yourself over to someone without any boundaries there. You want to make sure that it is reciprocal. If you're willing to give, that they can give back. So that's what I mean by thinking about who is in your squad. Who are the people who you know you can connect with, who will be there both through the good and the bad days. And that will have a really positive impact on your mental health and well-being. Another thing that our players kept referring to was the use of humour to get through the last couple of months or the start of lockdown. And I know we're not necessarily in full lockdown at the moment, but humour has been shown to have a great positive influence on our mental health and well-being. Whether it's sharing funny stories or sharing memes, we do have the technology to do that now. And it's not about belittling situations or making fun of certain people or certain kind of scenarios. It's more about having that awareness that, you know, life doesn't have to be really serious. There's so much seriousness going on at the moment. It is really beneficial to just have a laugh. And if it's within that squad of people who you count as really important, then all the better. The final kind of thing that I'm going to talk about is gratitude. Again, really one of the most scientifically proven positive impacts on your overall life satisfaction and health and happiness is the idea of being grateful. We, again, have had so much taken away from us lately. A lot of these things haven't been our choice, and that can leave us feeling really frustrated and angry. And we can always focus on the things that we can't do. We can't go out for dinner. We can't meet up with friends. We can't go outside of our county bounds. but what are the things that we can do? What are the things that you are grateful for in a day? I actually started at this, I think it was just as lockdown was starting, a friend got in touch with me and she said, look, can we actually send each other our gratitude every day? And for some days, we'll text each other, and that's the only message that we will share of 3 things that we're grateful for. But every so often, we'll get extra messages, or I'll send a message to say, you know what, today was a bad day, and making me think of 3 things that I'm grateful for has actually helped me see the kind of light at the end of the tunnel. It's really easy to get bogged down on the negative. It's really easy to worry about what's going to happen in the future, or worry that you made a mistake in the past. But by focusing on the here and now and what you do have, it has a huge, positive, long-lasting impact on your mental health and well-being. So just a couple of take-home messages on this aspect of the webinar. Control the controllables. So much is outside of our control right now. What are the things that you can control, put your control on? What are the things that you can focus on that you can do? Set boundaries and learn how to say no. Protect yourself, protect your own well-being, and do put yourself first, because you can't pour from an empty cup. You have to put your own oxygen mask on first. Match review, reflect on your day. It can be really tough not to have that positive feedback, or not to have that immediate feedback from friends and colleagues. So how can you do that for yourself? How can you write down the things that have gone well and potentially areas that you can improve on or keep improving on? Find your squad. Think of the people who are important to you. Think of how you're going to connect with them, and think about how you're going to forge those positive relationships. Do you know that they're going to be able to give back to you what you're happy to give to them? And then obviously, like I said, it's all about the positive coping, using humor, using gratitude, thinking of positive ways to influence your mental well-being over the next while, and doing it with an intention. When a lot of this stuff, I'm sure, that I've just mentioned isn't brand new information, but when we think about it and we practice it with intention, it can have a much bigger impact on our positive mental health and well-being. So I will finish up there, and we'll go back to the panel. So Rob, I'll let you take back over.
Well, that was really impressive. There are so many times that we've heard a number of those different exhortations over the course of the last 6 months, but sometimes when you hear them just put into a different context, it actually works so much better. One thing that I was interested that you were talking about there was the kind of process that your friend and you decided to put in place, that we will do this. And I wonder, does that come from a sporting background? I know, players in training, they're told what to do, where to stand, when to move, when to think, next ball, next move. It's a process-driven, game now that professional sport has become. For many, though, that idea of, well, we will promise that we will send each other our own gratitude every day. Is that something that you think you need to just get over any discomfort with that or unease about it, that it really does have a value?
Yeah, I think, and I kind of maybe didn't focus enough on it in that very short presentation, but I think doing things with intention, a lot of the time we know what's good for us, we know what will benefit us, both whether it's physical or emotional. But it's actually, if you do it with intention, if you make sure that you have a plan, when you have the goal to do something, and again, that's something that is so abundant in the sporting arena. If, what is it? A dream without a plan is just a dream. Whereas if you put something into motion, if you make the intention to do it. Another analogy that I've kind of used a lot is, it's a nice day today, might go out for a walk, and I look out the window and I think, well, do I need a coat? Will I be too warm? And I can't remember who said this to me the very first time, but I remember hearing, it's better looking at it than for it. So when it comes to these moments of crisis, we know what we need, but we don't necessarily have it in front of us. So if we make the plan to get it in front of us, to practice it with intention, then we won't have to scramble around and look for it. And it's kind of like, it's almost building yourself that safety net. And yeah, sometimes a lot of the stuff, especially with positive psychology and being proactive, can seem, and I don't want to mean this in a disparaging way, quite American. We're a very modest people in Ireland. You ask someone how they're feeling, they're grand. They may have just won the lotto. They're not necessarily going to say that to you. Even sometimes you'll talk to the players, how was your match? Ah, yeah, it was grand. They got player of the game. You know, there's that kind of modesty that is built into the society. And it can be very hard sometimes to think of good things and to be positive. And I think, yeah, you do kind of just have to, like you said, get over yourself and put it into intention so that it will have that benefit for you.
I do remember the lid being lifted on that for me at the London 2012 Olympics, where they had planned that they were going to have people with big foam hands standing outside tube stations in London, and it was going to be really happy clappy. And I thought, that is so American. English people are just not going to do that. And I was lucky enough to be there, and it just worked brilliantly. That sort of idea of actually just, you know, committing yourself to it and being present and being in the moment. If I can come to you, Damien, that sense of looking at it from our mind, from inside our mind, to actually, you know, reference what we're doing in the real world. Psychology has probably never been as much to the fore, ironically, at a time when we're dealing with a very, you know, a challenge to our physiology. It's our psychology that's actually going to get us through it. Listening to Hannah's presentation there and seeing it from your perspective in a clinical environment, how has Ireland been coping as such over the course of these 6 months?
Yeah, good question. And I agree or echo the sentiment. You know, the narrative has changed around mental health in general. I think we're maybe embracing our psychological world a lot more easily and naturally than we used to. It wasn't that long ago when we would prefer to sweep conversations under the carpet, move on, not name things. So even, you know, there are words now and terms that exist for things that we just would have described as nerves, or she's taken to the bedroom, or he's taken to the bedroom, mind you, or he drinks too much. You know, these would have been simplified terms. But bringing it back to the present day, I'm afraid Hannah has stolen the few kind of slogans that I was going to introduce or drop in there in terms of pouring from an empty cup and self-care, etc. But yeah, look, COVID is described as a once in a century pandemic. We don't have a frame of reference for this. You know, even our most elderly relatives, they might have lived through, you know, really challenging times for sure. But something on the scale of COVID, you know, goes back quite a way. So we don't really have a frame of reference for it. It's testing us societally, culturally, and psychologically at a variety of different levels. And I think, as Hannah touched on, you know, if it was a short-term burst of stress and challenge, I think we can kind of grapple with that more easily. When things persist for longer than we want them to, that's when an additional challenge really comes in, and our mental health or our psychology just in general is tested sometimes beyond its limits. You know, not everyone's going to be struggling. There's lots of research going on at the moment. I know Deirdre is conducting research on the player front. I'm conducting research in a more healthcare worker setting across hospital sites, etc. And the research is consistently pointing out that we're not doing great. There's a good number of us, proportionately, what, you know, 1 in 5, or sorry, I should say 50%, one in two are doing okay. We're getting by. We're managing. You know, our resources are adequate to cope with the demands of our life, and bringing us back to the well-being kind of analogy that Hannah was touching on. And then there's a 20 to 30% bracket where we're experiencing heightened distress relative to what we were before. But many of us were experiencing distress before COVID ever came along as well. So it's important to acknowledge that. But there is a slight increase. There's a few different studies trying to estimate, you know, how much additional stress is COVID introducing. And one of the more accurate studies that I could certainly get my hands on is saying between 8 and 10% on top of what life had going on before is what we're across the board at group level experiencing now. When you drill into that, though, you're going to find marked distress in sort of subgroups of society. Younger people, I know they might get a bad name for congregating and drinking on, somewhere out in Galway in NUIG, or you'll see these headlines and, they're not great at social distancing, etc., etc. But on the whole, they have been quite impacted. They've, their schooling, their structure, their routines have been just turned upside down and inside out. Their exam issues for some of them again was again it was their ability to control the controllables was removed from them, and it introduces a lot of uncertainty into our lives, whether you're young, whether you're middle-aged like myself, or whether you're on the elderly front. The fear of getting ill and passing it on to those more susceptible. There's a number of subgroups that are more impacted by this and being additionally psychologically tested by it. And we have coping skills. Hannah's mentioned a bunch of them there, and I guess I always talk to patients that I work with in groups and at individual levels about our coping toolbox. And I think just to tie it back into the last point that was being made about action planning, if I'm to maybe be challenged to say in a few words or less what the two things I focus most on in trying to help people manage their situations and often chronic or persistent symptoms, physically and mentally, it's problem solving, which sounds really simple, and it isn't, and action planning, which sounds really simple, and it isn't. So you can actually sit for an hour and get someone to identify the problem. What they think is a problem is not actually a problem, and you've got to drill into it a little bit more. And that can be a process in and of itself. Once you identify the problem, you're halfway there then towards planning some actions around that. And that's mobilizing, that gives us assurance that we're actually capable of doing something about it. Obviously tapping into motivation, whatever motivations might exist for an individual to address whatever problem or issue it is that they're trying to grapple with in their own lives. And it's not just one, we've got loads of stuff going on. So sometimes it's about selecting the most pressing issue that a person has and then actioning some plans and goals around that.
I honestly feel I need to spend about an hour a day with you just to make me feel better.
Trust me, you don't.
Deirdre, we've mentioned there about the review going on with the players, and the theme of this morning is about the return to the workplace. Those of us who don't necessarily work on the pitch in professional sport might look and think, well, it's hardly the workplace. They're just going back and they're playing sport. But it's they're coming back in, and they're coming back in closer contact and in closer quarters than than most of us would ever have to face. The research, the survey, the anecdotal, the conversation side of things that you've actually had with the players over the past, sort of 8 weeks or so since they've been back in there, how has the rugby population actually dealt with and coped with the coming back?
Yeah, and I think it's important, the players are people first. So when you talk about the anxieties they have maybe elderly parents, they may be living with young children, they work with coaches who have small kids maybe in school, and they have all the anxieties that we all have about returning to the workplace. And what if I, get COVID? What if I pass it on? Even after the last match, some of the guys had coughs, and there was a real fear in the camp that, oh my God, maybe I have something and I've been in contact with someone else. And that is all there, and it's all very real. But I think, as Hannah has said, how they're dealing with that and how they're coping with that is just, this was getting through this week to week, and not really looking beyond that, because they're not sure their whole program could be shut down, with a week's notice. A lot like all of our workplaces were. The last time I was here in this office was the 12th of March. I haven't been here in 7 months. So really strange. We were told on that day, pack up your laptops, go home, and we'll let you know when you can come back. So all those things, controlling what they can control. And, they're going in and they're getting their testing done. They're working in smaller pods. They're, trying to be as safe as possible. They don't have team meetings anymore. So they're all working within, as much as possible, the guidelines. And their lives have been restricted. probably under more sanctions than the general public. You know, they've been asked to limit their contacts because they know that they could nearly, I suppose, wipe out their workforce if one of them tests positive. So it has been difficult for a lot of them, but I think, as Damien was saying there, you know, there's a squad of 40 and maybe 25 to 30 of them will be doing pretty okay. They've got good support networks. You know, they're back to work. They're doing okay, but there will be a few, and it just depends on their circumstances. You know, there could be a lot of players, you know, especially the guys who left last year, they didn't get to leave the game the way they wanted. You know, they were told in March to stop playing, and now there's no contract. So a lot of players will have short-term contracts, you know, and I can only see the IRFU putting more short-term contracts in place. So the security in their role, you know, it has opened players' eyes to, yeah, I can only control what I can do this week. You know, I can do my best in training to make the team. If I make the team, you know, I'll hopefully make the team next week. If I make the team next week, you know, Andy Farrell might see me, you know, get called up to the Irish squad. So very much working on short-term goals of what they can do right now to put them in the best position. And I think Hannah touched on it as well, you know, the idea of just reflecting on what you do every week. So what has gone well, and trying to focus on the strengths. And I'm based in Connacht with Andy Friend, so I suppose I know how he works and his personality, and he's very much a strengths-based coach, you know, and he'll always talk about what's your weapon, why are you here, why are you part of the squad, and that can be really good for players to focus on when there's a lot of bad news going around. You know, why am I here, or what are my strengths, and how can I work on those while still maybe recognizing some of my weaknesses. So I think, as Hannah said, the checking in on each other, and I think it has to be authentic check-ins, you know, not just a how you doing, fine. And I think that's where Tackle Your Feelings has really come in, and it has allowed players to have more real conversations that actually, I'm not doing okay. I'm struggling a bit this week, or things mightn't be going so well at home. Or if you're living in a group where some houses might have 5 or 6 players in it, and that at any one week, those players could be at different points. One person has been dropped, one person has been selected, one person has made the Irish team, one person is injured. So it's getting them to recognize that, where maybe to take their biases out of conversation and just to be there and be present for each other, and how are you doing, and listening to what the other person is saying. So I think that's been really important for the players, that kind of just being genuine, and if you're struggling, to say that you are.
There is something of a social contract between us, though, that, and maybe it is particularly Irish, that when we ask somebody, how are you doing, we expect I'm grand, and we expect then to move on to what it is that we really wanted to say. I know Caroline Clark has put into the chat there about that we need to be prepared, that somebody will now, perhaps more than ever before, actually say, I'm not grand, I'm not okay, I'm really struggling. And what's the responsibility on us as individuals, or on, you know, the players amongst their own network there, to actually deal with that? Because if somebody opens up and we don't respond positively, then that can always be more damaging. Or is that overthinking it a little bit?
I'll kind of jump in here a little bit, if that's okay. So two things that we kind of, well, we talk about so much in Tackle Your Feelings, but two other messages that we kind of want to get across as well is, a lot of the time, in order to understand how other people are feeling, you kind of have to first understand yourself. So kind of building your own awareness will help you become more empathetic towards other people's kind of, I suppose, downtimes or the issues that they may face. So if you can kind of recognize your own emotions, and you can understand, like Damien was talking about there, that kind of problem solving, like what is the issue? Why are you angry, or why are you upset? A lot of the time we don't necessarily know because we haven't dealt with it. So when you learn how to deal with your own emotions, you can become more understanding to someone else. In the Tackle Your Feelings app and on the website, we actually have a section that goes into how to communicate with people. Communication is key. And a lot of the time when you talk about communication, you automatically think, well, how can I get my point across? And that's a really important thing to learn. And it's very important to learn how to be assertive in certain situations. But one of the big things that we talk about in the Tacky Your Feelings app and in the communication section is how to listen to people, how to have a conversation where you're not waiting for your turn to say something, you're actually taking on what they're saying. And a lot of the time, when someone does want to talk to you, if they are going through, if they are having a bad day, or if they are nervous about going back into the office, it's not because they want you to solve the problem. They actually just want to talk to someone. So one of the best things you can do as an individual, and I suppose that's as far as your responsibility should go, is just to listen to them. And if necessary, help support them figure out the issue, whether it's supporting them in talking to someone else, talking to a professional, or just kind of supporting them in identifying their strengths. So they might talk about, you know, being nervous about going into the office, or being nervous about going back into the workplace or integrating into kind of larger crowds. And you can ask them, well, what are the things that you can control? What are the things that you can do? What will make you feel better? What is your strength in this situation? And I think, to be honest, that is as far as our own personal responsibility should be. We aren't, again, it goes back to the kind of looking after yourself as well. Don't take on the world's issues. Like, don't try and problem solve for everyone, but do be supportive, listen to what they have to say, and then help point them in the right direction. And Damien, I don't know if you want to, if there's anything you want to add to that, or correct me if I'm wrong on any of those points.
Yeah, no, Hannah, well said. You know, I know in, I won't name the hospital, but in the hospital, one of the Dublin hospitals here, over the pandemic, the psychology kind of department, we spearheaded an initiative which was to introduce psychological first aid modules to teams or folks that, you know, may have sought it or have been interested in receiving input like that. And again, it's about building resilience at the individual level, at the team level, or group level, whatever your group or team might, or squad might look like, and then at the organizational level. And each of those levels is going to require a different kind of response. I think individually we might want to identify and problem solve and action plan around those things. But you're right. I think if you're hearing a colleague, and we do mean that, we don't mean it literally in the Irish context, how are you doing? Don't tell me how you're doing. It's just a segue into a chit chat, right? It's not a question I want you to answer honestly. But in the event someone actually does answer it honestly, or it just comes up, and it's important that it, you know, there is space or scope for stuff like this to come up. You know, I don't know. It's my world, so I'm much more au fait with it. But I know it depends on the settings and context and personnel. Some people just are averse to feelings and emotions, and I think, you know, if I'm being honest, I think males are perhaps a bit more guilty of that, for better, for worse, or what have you. You know, but in the event it does come up with a colleague of any gender or hue, it's not about problem solving for someone else. It's actually, as Hannah was saying, just hearing them out, giving them the time and space, and I guess creating the safety in whatever environment you're in. And that might actually be, listen, this sounds important. How about we kind of, you know, earmark a little time later on to go for a chat or have coffee, or how about we come back into my own office here, we'll close the door, we'll have a chat, I'll hear you out, and just, you know, see where that goes. And sometimes signposts, but it's about feeling the mood, reading the room, and listening, active listening, not problem solving for someone else. I think that is something that it's not always wrong, but it can, the risk of it becoming problematic increases, you know, because that's not always what someone's doing.
We just need to remember that we have 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that's probably with good reason. Interesting that you mentioned there about the fact that males tend to be more stoic and, you know, sort of, we don't want to share our feelings and things like that. I love the fact it's absolutely right. Our panel today should be 50% male and female, but it's interesting. I'm looking at the room, and the attendance in the room is 70% female, and I wonder, is there a gap? And Deirdre, you might just sort of give us some insight on this. You'd work with the men's and women's teams and the players. Is there a difference in the way that a team environment will actually handle the return to normality? Because it seems to be that men will want to understand this, but not really perhaps give themselves the time or maybe the permission to understand it, whereas women are intuitively more aligned to the way of looking after the group, looking after themselves.
Yeah, and I think maybe Damien will speak more on, maybe women talk more, just as a way of, venting or chatting, or I suppose being more open to how they're feeling. So when you do ask me how you doing, I'll probably tell you, whereas guys might say fine. But I think it's the culture of the organization, and it's not just that it's a male organization, but who's the head coach, who's the manager, who's the performance director, and how do they set the scene around how people behave when they come back. And I think like that, a lot of women's sports might have a lot of males at the top. So, it's not that different, because when they go in, that scene is set. And resilience often resides in the environment. It's not just something, so if you have that environment that allows you to kind of go, it's all right not to be okay. It's okay to be anxious. And I do find a lot of the medical staff and a lot of the physios set the scene in training as well. And they're often, psychologists at heart. They hear a lot on the tables, and it's nearly how that scene is set as well. So I'm not quite sure it's male, female. Certainly in the last few years, the men have got better at talking. They mightn't do it as a group. They might prefer to call you aside and say, I'm struggling. Or what they're quite good at is saying, I'm worried about someone else. And whether they're talking about themselves or whether they are actually worried about someone else. So I think that is changing, but I do think maybe that there is a male-female difference in just how we cope and how we might articulate our feelings.
I noticed on the sideline in the backroom team in Slovakia, they had a couple of women within the sort of the core group yesterday, and I don't remember seeing any women on the Irish team, and Slovakia won. So maybe that's a thing. Maybe we just need to get more women involved in the coaching on the men's and the women's side. I'm conscious of time, and I'm conscious of the fact that I do want to give an opportunity to those of you in the room, if you would like to ask a question. If you just click on the Q&A button down there, and you can put it to any or all of the panelists. In the time we have left, I just want to check in as such. Are there ways in which we could be preparing ourselves to go back to work? Is there something that we, as line managers, that we should be doing in order to actually facilitate an easier transition back for individuals who might, as we said at the top of the show, be excited about getting back or very anxious about getting back? And is there a toolkit that we should be looking at from that perspective? And maybe Damien, if I can kick off with you on that.
Yeah, I guess I was initially thinking of it at a personal level, but if I was to try or attempt to put a managerial hat on me, it would probably incorporate a couple of things. One being to be there, to be supportive, just to be accessible, and if someone feels that they have something to say, or that you can even detect it in them, and that you're approachable around that, or indeed you might even initiate, or make it known to individuals or groups that, look, if anyone has concerns, you're available to have a discussion around that. And anecdotally, I know this interesting kind of 75% split of attendees for this webinar mirrors. I've just completed, along with a team of research colleagues, a survey across five hospitals, 2,000 staff, 80% response rate for females, 20% of the respondents have been male. So there is definitely a gender dimension to this. And I'm not saying for better or worse, because it's about understanding where someone is at an individual level, and like taking time to themselves or isolate, being a little bit more withdrawn. That's not always a bad thing. I enjoy my own company, whereas for someone else, I would know it's out of character and unusual, and I would kind of pick up on that and maybe reach out, knowing that they've become a bit more withdrawn, and that might indicate or signal something. slightly untoward going on. But one of the things I've picked up from that research is feedback, which hasn't necessarily been captured in the survey itself, but it's the second tool in the toolkit, as it were. Flexibility. If there's scope for flexibility, I think maybe COVID has thrust upon us the need for flexibility, maybe working from home some of the time, working in the office some of the time, and maybe not having to adhere rigidly to this routine of 9 to 5, especially when the schools were off, parents were doing drop-offs, or sorry, they weren't doing drop-offs, but they were, I guess, having to tend to family matters, that weren't part of the traditional or conventional routine. So, flexibility is important, and I've heard that a lot amongst colleagues, staff, and some of the respondents to the research that I was doing.
Okay. We have a question coming in. Sorry, I'm like the radio host now who's reading it out as he's reading it, but it's anonymous. What you've talked about in terms of the squad and having designated leader for social support is really interesting. How could it be applied to broader workplaces, and particularly where people are working apart and not yet back in work? So should we have, outside of the line management scheme of things, should there be somebody as a designated, it could be the forward captain, or it could be the equivalent of within each of our teams?
And this was implemented during lockdown, so the players weren't together, so everyone was remote when this happened. So there was the head coach, and then there was the leadership group, so maybe 8. So you might pick on 8 designated, there could be the next line managers down, or unit leads, and then they each got 8 players, and then they checked in on each other. So it nearly worked every way, and it was just a phone call, a text, and we all have the technology now to see each other's faces. And I think certainly when I run my one-to-one meetings, I'd ask the guys to be on Zoom so I can see their face, so I can see their expression, and I know that they're tuning in to me. So it might just be a simple way of, if you've got a group of 40 kind of small business, that you divide them into 5 pods of 8, and you elect a leader or someone volunteers to be that person to coordinate the calls. And I think it's very important then to schedule those calls into your working day, that they don't become part of something else that you have to do. So that is part of work, of just like you'd have maybe a coffee for 10-15 minutes in the day, that you schedule those throughout the week.
And Zoom does have the technology to split into separate rooms as well. So they're, the technology, it's wonderful and slightly creepy at the same time, that they should be so far ahead of the game. One more question from Frank Dillon. Frank works in men's sheds, who do a great job at trying to get us out of ourselves on the male side. And Frank is asking, should there be are there different coping skills? Should we split along gender lines to actually sort of encourage men and women to talk differently, or is that running counter to the sort of the prevailing trend that equality means, all being in this together?
I think for men, and like with men's sheds, it's the perfect example. Men tend to talk when they're doing something else. So women will happily gather to have a talk, whereas men it's almost a consequence of, working or meeting up to do some woodwork in a men's shed, and that's how conversation kind of comes up, so that the focus isn't on it. So I think with everything, and with every single individual, and it kind of goes in all aspects of sport, there will be different approaches that will work for different people. There isn't one size fits all. And I think you have to almost recognize with yourself what does work for you, what do you feel comfortable with doing, how do you feel comfortable reaching out to someone. So in the example of me and my friend, we wanted, she's aware of psychology, she studies psychology as well, so she knew the benefit of sharing a gratitude list. So that's why we were able to connect in that way. And that worked for us, but it wouldn't necessarily be something that I would go around and impose on everybody else. Because some people aren't comfortable. So it's finding ways that work for you and work for the individual. If you are that leader of that designated kind of squad group, or the kind of connected group that you're going to create in your organization, like try a few things, trial and error. Like you don't have to know the answer straight away. You don't have to go in with this is how it's going to work and we're 100% going to work at it. Try a few different things. If one thing sticks, then go with that. Like, again, nothing with sports psychology, with positive psychology, should be an uphill battle. If it becomes an arduous task, then it's not necessarily working. But there are so many different options of looking into ways, whether it's socially distanced coffee, a socially distanced walking group, a socially distanced like poker game, or Zoom quiz. Like, again, there are so many different things, and explore your options. Give yourself the time to find it. And should there be a gender split? Again, depends. I know a lot of girls and a lot of female friends who do not want to talk to me, and I know a lot of male friends who will happily chew the ear off me about their feelings. So it just comes down to what suits that individual, what suits that group. Find the group norm and go with that.
I love the fact of figuring it out in the moment as the game unfolds. It would wreck Joe Schmidt's head if he was listening into us at the moment now, but he's got his own new job anyway to look after. I'm conscious of the time. We're right up on the end. I just want, before we go, to just take from each of you one thing that you're doing actually in your own personal life to actually make sure that you're staying right. And I'll kick it off. I started out at the beginning of this and I said, well, I'm going to take an hour out a day to go out for a walk, sometimes with my wife, or she's busy, sometimes with a podcast, and just go out and walk for an hour and devote that time to yourself. How about you, Hannah?
I think, and I know I didn't touch on this at all, and it's the first time I'm bringing it up, but I think it's really important. I think you really have to manage your expectations with how you're going to cope with what's happening. At the start of COVID and the start of lockdown, I had a full list of things I was going to achieve, and I didn't achieve them. And if you have your expectations up too high, if you think you're going to be a super survivor who's going to learn a new language, pick up a musical instrument, learn how to cook a 7-course meal and bake a banana bread every week, that can in itself become overwhelming. So it's almost like managing your own coping mechanisms, realizing, again, we don't necessarily have the capacity to take on everything right now. So finding one thing. So again, I'm doing that gratitude. I've continued doing the gratitude message with my friend every day. And it even got so far as turning to my partner and being like, what are you grateful for today? So I kind of brought it into the home as well. So that's something that I'm definitely going to keep up. And I'm also going to manage my expectations that I'm not going to become a super yoga instructor over this lockdown, because it didn't happen at all.
Next time around, perhaps. And Damien?
Yeah, I was going to say that I started running again for the first time in 15 years, which is true, but you've already touched on or ticked the exercise box, so I'm going to be a bit more honest and transparent. I've actually learned a new skill, and that is to start brewing my own beer. On my third batch, I would recommend it.
Now I definitely need to spend an hour a day with you. And Deirdre?
Yeah, I've actually, it's always something I said I would do, but I started to teach my children the piano, which is like, oh, I've never had time for it before. And it's always like, oh, I'll do it another time. But so like I have 2 hours less every day that I'm not in the car, or 2 hours more. And I promised myself, yeah, we started during lockdown. Teaching 3 boys who don't really want to learn the piano is a skill in itself, but it has just given us time to do something fun and silly, and it doesn't matter to me whether they want to play it or not, but it's just spending a little bit more time with my family.
Great. I think each of those are noble ambitions. I've really enjoyed this. I think that it's the kind of conversation which I would happily extend for another hour, but life gets in the way. We can't do that. It has been a real pleasure. Next week, we're back at the same time, and we're looking at the impact on third level sport of what the pandemic and the lockdown restrictions have been, which is going to be another interesting conversation. If it's half as interesting as today's, I will be a very happy chap. So for being part of that and for making it so, our thanks to Dr. Deirdre Lyons, Dr. Damien Lowry, and Dr. Hannah McCormack. It has been an excellent session. Thank you, everybody, for joining us, and stay safe and be kind to yourselves out there. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Guys.
Thank you.
Bye.